The chlorine scent of the water was sharp in the humid Texas air, a smell Sterling usually associated with summer joy. But as he watched a woman with sunglasses perched on her head speaking venomously into her phone, all he felt was a cold dread solidifying in his gut. His children, just moments ago splashing with glee, were now silent behind him, their laughter stolen by the woman's piercing stare. Sterling knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was an accusation, and they were already being tried and convicted in her eyes. It's amazing how quickly a perfect day can turn into a nightmare, isn't it? Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a public confrontation that came out of nowhere. The scene had started so simply. Sterling, his 8-year-old son Julian, and his 6-year-old daughter Amara had just moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oak Creek Meadows a month ago. It was their first chance to use the community pool, a beautiful oasis promised in the realtor's brochure. The kids were ecstatic. For Sterling, a single father who worked long hours as a graphic designer, this was a small slice of heaven, a chance to see his children's unfiltered joy. He'd barely settled into a lounge chair when the woman appeared. She had a stiff, regal posture and held a clipboard like a weapon. Without so much as a hello, she had marched over and demanded to know which house they belonged to. Sterling, though taken aback by her tone, had answered politely, giving his new address. The woman, who introduced herself as Beatrice, the president of the Homeowners Association, had simply sniffed and said, "I don't recognize you." Sterling had tried to explain they were new residents, even offering to go home and get his deed as proof. But Beatrice wasn't interested in proof. She was interested in control. She pulled out her phone and, in a loud voice laced with false panic, began reporting a trespassing incident involving several individuals who refused to leave the premises. That's when the situation truly spiraled. Sterling's heart hammered against his ribs. He gathered Julian and Amara close, their wet bodies trembling slightly, though whether from the cool air or from fear he couldn't tell. He tried to speak to Beatrice again, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. "Ma'am, I'm a resident. My name is Sterling Abbott. We just moved into 1422 Willow Lane. Can we please just handle this without involving the police?" Beatrice ignored him completely, continuing her dramatic performance for the 911 dispatcher. She described Sterling in a way that made his skin crawl, painting him as an aggressive intruder. A few other families at the pool looked on, some with sympathy, others with a practiced indifference, clearly not wanting to get involved. Humiliation washed over Sterling. This was supposed to be a happy memory, their first day at the pool in their new home. Instead, his children were witnessing their father being treated like a criminal. Just as the first wail of a distant siren reached them, a man stood up from a nearby table. He was tall and lean, with a calm demeanor that stood in stark contrast to Beatrice's manufactured hysteria. "Beatrice, what on earth are you doing?" he asked, his voice even but firm. He walked over, placing himself between Beatrice and Sterling's family. "This man is a resident. I saw the moving trucks myself last month." Beatrice finally hung up her phone, her gaze shifting to the newcomer with annoyance. "Alton, this doesn't concern you. This is official HOA business. These people don't belong here." Alton didn't back down. "Official business? You're harassing a new neighbor in front of his children." "His name is Sterling," he said, extending a hand to Sterling. "I'm Alton Pierce from down the street. Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm sorry you're getting this kind of welcome." Sterling shook his hand, a wave of relief washing over him, but it was short-lived. The arrival of 2 police officers brought a fresh wave of tension. Beatrice immediately launched into her story, her voice filled with a victim's tremble. The officers listened patiently, their expressions unreadable. When they turned to Sterling, he explained the situation calmly, his kids clinging to his legs. Alton corroborated his story, explaining that Beatrice had a history of being overzealous. But Beatrice was the HOA president, a known quantity. Sterling was a stranger. The officers, while polite, insisted on seeing his identification and proof of residency. The intervention had failed. Sterling had to endure the shame of walking back to his house, his children trailing behind him, to retrieve his driver's license and a utility bill while the police waited. When he returned and they confirmed his address, they gave Beatrice a mild warning about misusing emergency services, but to Sterling, the damage was done. They left, and the encounter was officially over. But the sting of prejudice and false accusation remained. Beatrice shot him a triumphant smirk before turning on her heel and marching away. Sterling felt defeated, the joy of the day completely extinguished. Later that evening, Alton stopped by Sterling's house. "I can't apologize enough for what happened today," he said, his face etched with genuine remorse. "Beatrice has been on a power trip for years, but this is the worst I've ever seen." Sterling, still shaken, invited him in. "I just don't understand," Sterling said, sinking onto his couch. "We just moved here. We wanted a fresh start. Now my kids are scared of our own neighborhood." Alton nodded grimly. "That's Beatrice's specialty. She targets anyone she decides doesn't fit her perfect image of Oak Creek Meadows." He then revealed he was a lawyer. "I've mostly handled corporate law," he admitted, "but what she did today, it's not just rude, it's harassment. And I have a feeling you're not the first person she's done this to." That was the spark. Alton's words planted an idea in Sterling's mind. This wasn't just about his family anymore. This was about standing up to a bully. Alton offered to help him look into the HOA's bylaws and review any past complaints filed against Beatrice. For the first time that day, Sterling felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't going to let this woman chase him out of his own home. The fight had just begun. Their first step was to dig into the community's records. Alton spent a weekend poring over the HOA's online portal, a convoluted mess of meeting minutes and bylaws. He discovered a pattern. Over the past 3 years, there had been a dozen official warnings issued by Beatrice for unauthorized use of facilities, but they were all vague, with no names attached. However, Alton noticed that these warnings spiked during the summer months and seemed to coincide with new families moving into the neighborhood. "She's using the bylaws as her personal weapon," Alton concluded, showing Sterling the data on his laptop. "But without names, we can't prove a pattern of targeting." Their first small win came from an unexpected place. Sterling, determined to meet his neighbors and show he wasn't an intruder, attended a neighborhood potluck the following week. He was nervous, but he forced himself to be friendly. He struck up a conversation with a woman named Maria who had lived in Oak Creek for 5 years. When Sterling cautiously recounted his experience at the pool, Maria's friendly expression hardened. "She did the same thing to my cousin last summer," she said in a low voice. "He was visiting for the weekend, and we were at the pool. Beatrice called security on him, claiming he was a suspicious individual. He's a firefighter, for goodness sake." This was the breakthrough they needed. Maria's cousin, Carlos, was more than willing to provide a written statement about his humiliating encounter with Beatrice. He had never filed a formal complaint, fearing it would cause trouble for Maria, but hearing about Sterling's experience changed his mind. Now they had a second victim. The problem was, Beatrice was an external antagonist with the full power of the HOA behind her. She controlled the board, which was made up of her close friends who rubber-stamped her every decision. When Alton submitted a formal complaint on Sterling's behalf, along with Carlos's statement, it was dismissed within 48 hours. The official response, signed by Beatrice herself, stated that she had been acting in her capacity as president to ensure the safety of the community. The major setback came a week later. Sterling received a certified letter in the mail. It was a formal notice from the HOA fining him $200 for verbal assault against an HOA board member and for failure to present proof of residency upon request. It was a complete fabrication. Beatrice was twisting the story, painting herself as the victim and Sterling as the aggressor. "She's trying to bury us in fines and bureaucracy," Sterling said, his voice tight with fury as he showed the letter to Alton. "She's making it official. Now it's my word against hers in the records." Alton's jaw was set. This is classic intimidation. She thinks she can bully you into silence. But instead of silencing them, it fueled their resolve. They now knew that a simple complaint wasn't enough. They had to take the fight to the entire community. They had to expose Beatrice for the tyrant she was. Alton began working a new angle. He and Sterling started going door to door, not as accusers, but as concerned neighbors. They spoke to dozens of residents, sharing their story and asking if anyone else had experienced similar issues. At first, many were reluctant to talk, fearing retribution from Beatrice. But as more people heard Sterling's story, a quiet undercurrent of shared frustration began to surface. They found a family who'd been fined for their child's sidewalk chalk art, an elderly man who was threatened with legal action over the height of his rose bushes, and a young couple who had been reprimanded for having the wrong shade of front door. Each story was a small injustice on its own, but together they painted a picture of a woman who wielded her minor authority like a monarch. They collected 5 more signed statements. The final test would be the upcoming annual HOA meeting. It was the one time all homeowners were invited to voice their concerns. Alton formally requested to be added to the agenda, citing a pattern of board overreach and resident harassment. Beatrice couldn't legally deny the request, though she made it clear she was not happy about it. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. Beatrice sat at the head of the table looking smug and confident. When it was Alton's turn to speak, a hush fell over the room. He didn't begin with accusations. Instead, he started by talking about the meaning of community. He spoke of neighbors looking out for one another, of shared spaces meant for joy and relaxation, not for suspicion and conflict. Then, calmly and methodically, he laid out the facts. He told Sterling's story, then he read the statement from Carlos, and then one by one, he invited the other residents he had spoken with to stand and share their own experiences. As each person spoke, the mood in the room shifted from quiet curiosity to palpable anger. Beatrice's confident facade began to crack. She tried to interrupt, to dismiss the stories as minor disagreements, but the residents were no longer listening to her. The climax came when Alton presented his final piece of evidence. A resident who lived across from the pool had a security camera. He had captured the entire incident with Sterling's family. Alton played the video on a projector for everyone to see. There was no audio, but the visuals were damning. It showed Sterling's calm demeanor, his children cowering behind him, and Beatrice's aggressive posturing and venomous expression as she spoke on the phone. The room was silent. The video was undeniable proof that Beatrice had lied. She had not been a concerned president, she had been a bully. When the video ended, a man in the back of the room stood up. "I make a motion to remove Beatrice from the HOA board, effective immediately." A woman seconded it. A vote was called, and the decision was nearly unanimous. Beatrice was stripped of her title, right there in front of the entire community she had lorded over for years. But it didn't end there. In the following weeks, Alton helped the residents organize a class action lawsuit against Beatrice for harassment and misuse of HOA funds, which their investigation had also uncovered. The board she had once controlled was dissolved and replaced with new members, including Sterling, who wanted to ensure no family ever felt unwelcome again. The community began to heal. The next weekend, Sterling and his kids went back to the pool. This time, there were no stares, no accusations. Instead, neighbors smiled and waved. Maria brought over a plate of cookies. Another family invited Julian and Amara to join in a game of water polo. As Sterling watched his children splash and laugh, their joy finally restored. He knew they had found their home. He had not only won a battle for his own family, he had helped an entire community reclaim its spirit. What do you think is the best way to handle a neighbor who is a bully but holds a position of power like an HOA president? Should you confront them directly or gather support from others first? If you enjoyed this story of justice and community, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Every story shared helps us grow.